translate into accountability and action. Today's session aims to do exactly that. We are privileged to have with us an accomplished panelist, Ms. Shweta Nair, a maritime lawyer with a strong focus on international commercial arbitration, shipping, and marine insurance. She is currently advancing her career at United Maritime Law Chambers, where she applies her technical expertise to resolve complex maritime and arbitration matters. Shweta has valuable international exposure during her time in the United Kingdom. She served as a student director at Environmental Law and Policy Advice Clinic at City, University of London. There, she worked on research project examining how various London boroughs responded to the COP27 climate guidelines, particularly focusing on council's attitudes toward greenhouse gas emissions and their strategies to address climate change. We are truly looking forward to her insights on the intersection of environmental governance, maritime law, and global accountability. Please stay tuned till the end of the session as we will have an engaging Q&A segment where you will have the opportunity to raise your questions and interact directly with our panelist. Over to you, Shweta.
Thank you so much, Ankita, for that warm welcome. So I hope you're all doing well. Hello, everyone. I'll be dealing with the topic of environmental change and global accountability. So when we talk about global accountability, the question arises whether environmental compliance is necessary. So coming into the actual concept, which is environmental compliance, which is the basic crux of global accountability. When we talk about environmental compliance, the most important aspect of it is the international convention which enforce such compliance. First off, what is global accountability? When we talk about the definition of it, global accountability basically means the actions by the nations, corporations, or individuals. So it refers to the duty, which is basically talking about answerability for environmental consequences. It is of no doubt that the current environment is basically suffering and there has been environmental degradation every now and then. But how are the countries, the individuals, or the government supposed to be held accountable for their actions? So, this is where international environmental law comes into play. So, when we talk about international environmental law, it is basically a field of public international law governing how states and organizations manage to share the environmental issue in terms of dealing with the climate change first, then second is the resource depletion, and the third major problem is the pollution. So, when we talk about international environmental law in terms of its nature, the crux of the international environmental law is basically something to do with conventions, treaties, as well as agreements. So, when I talk about agreements, agreements are something that are more to do with soft law or the hard law. When certain countries enter into such conventions, when they are not really binding, for instance, Rio Declaration, the countries they think themselves that they are not really accountable. Therefore, there exists a lack of transparency and a sense of unethical behavior on such countries. However, when I talk about the Stockholm Conference of 1972, there is a little bit of a hard law existence, which basically holds the country more responsible. And when we talk about Stockholm Convention, there are basically 26 principles. So, in this convention, it basically established the link between the economic growth, pollution, and human well being, placing environmental issues on the international agenda. This basically recognized the need to protect resources for future generations as well. So basically, such conventions they just emphasize on the need to have a judicious utilization of the resources so that there exists a sustainable development. Because the most important part is to actually have a sustainable development without having to compromise the need of the future generations as well as looking after the needs of the current generation as well. So how do we balance that? This is when the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit of 1992, came about. This particular declaration consisted of 27 principles, which define the rights and responsibilities of nations, emphasizing human beings who were basically at the center of this particular declaration for enforcing the sustainable development. Now, when I talk about the regional conventions or the regional programs, there was one regional program as an example that I can state, which is the Action Oriented Program, which was the Ocean Seas Program. And that implemented the region specific activities which brought together stakeholders, governments, scientific communities, civil societies, indigenous people, and local communities to address the accelerating degradation of world's ocean and coastal areas through a shared seas approach. To actually summarize such conventions, sorry, so to actually summarize these conventions, what these conventions basically do is that they impose the polluters pay principle or the precautionary approach. So when I say polluters pay principle, it basically says that any entity who is responsible for causing any sort of pollution damage or any sort of degradation in terms of resources, they are the ones who have to be responsible for any sort of liability. It could be in terms of damages, compensation, or hefty fines or court order, which I'll be basically dealing in more detail in my later slides. So, talking about the recent trends in international environmental law, this I basically formulated in terms of the last year, 2025. There had been an intensive climate litigation, technological integration, and uh, data. There's corporate accountability and transparency, energy transition and decarbonization, nature based solutions and biodiversity, climate justice and social reckoning, global emission gap. So, since I just said it out in one after another, it might sound like a word salad right now. But in terms of breaking down such trends, what really has happened is that even though countries have entered into conventions or even enforced certain plans such as the circular economy action plan, what really has happened is there has existed this particular discrepancy between the current trend as well as the future prediction, which the countries as well as organizations have failed to kind of comply with the standards in order to deal with the problem of climate change. So let me tell you that in detail. So when we talk about global key developments, there are basically triple planetary crises that our planet has to basically deal with. First is the climate change. Second is the biodiversity loss and pollution. So when we talk about climate change, I'm sure everyone is aware about the whole global warming situation. And even though there is the Paris Agreement, which was enforced in 2015, and it came to implement such norms so that the global emissions they peak from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2.2 degrees Celsius in the incoming years, so that by 2030 it would be able to achieve its goals. But however, the planet hasn't seemed to meet that expectation. And in terms of biodiversity loss, we are still not able to deal with the crisis of biomagnification, since even though there has been an implementation of Stockholm Convention and Rio Declaration, but still there exists the crisis of biomagnification among living organisms, which is basically if we follow up the food chain in a nutrition cycle, there exists an accumulation of toxicity in the living organisms. So, what can happen is that there would be literal disruption in the ecosystem. And when we talk about pollution, there are a variety of pollution happening right now in this planet, which is basically air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, which I'll be dealing with later. When I talk about corporate accountability, lawsuits like one against Lockheed Martin for alleged birth defects from factory emissions highlight the holding companies responsible for environmental harm. So basically, when we talk about factories, there are certain industries that do not follow the ISO 14001 of 2015 standard, which is basically the environmental management system that every industry is supposed to comply with. However, they don't. So there have been incidents where factories have been held responsible through climate litigation instances. And moving on to the anti-deforestation laws, the EU is delaying its deforestation regulation implementation, showing the ongoing challenges in enforcing the global supply chain rules. Next is the Plastic Pollution Treaty. So it basically aims to create enforceable global rules, unlike voluntary agreements. It covers plastic from creation, which is basically the raw materials, through use, reuse, recycling, and final disposal. The main goal for plastic pollution treaty is to eliminate plastic pollution, protect health, foster circular economies, and develop alternatives. So plastic pollution treaty basically focuses on this target, which is to eliminate pollution by 2040, with implementation envisioned soon after 2025. Governance and actors. So when we talk about governance and actors, this is when the United Nations come into play and its organs. So basically, it promotes circularity in national climate pledges and through waste management strategies. For instance, during the Tokyo Olympics, it was actually pertinent to note that Tokyo actually managed to come up with this idea of recycling e-waste to produce the medals made out of at least certain 3,000 kg of medals made from recycled e-waste, basically like old laptops, phones, and all, which was a big initiative on a country to be able to manage their waste strategically. European Union was one of the entities which led with ambitious circular economy action plan, including digital product passports and new waste directives, national policies which came into play to meet the same circular goals, transforming waste streams like textiles, furniture, and food waste. So when I say circular goals, it basically just means that there would be raw materials. They are utilized to make up certain product. But at the same time, when we use the product, there needs to be a chance that there happens to be recycling later on, or at least reusing. So what's happening is manufacturing is being followed by usage and then recycling. So nothing is being followed in a linear mode of production, which is to take something, use it, and reuse it. So ISO 14001 is basically just an EMS standard, which a company is supposed to be held accountable to. And the key integration points to the ISO 14001 is the life cycle perspective, significance of environmental aspects, and compliance obligations, continuous improvement, and the specific circular economy actions are also supported by the waste minimization, resource efficiency, and the supply chain collaboration. So when I talk about ISO 14001, it's not really something like a convention. It's just a standard which an entity is supposed to comply with. And in case this compliance does not exist, then the company is penalized for it. So this is basically how an EMS works. First is the plan of action, then there's the doing of the action, then it is checked and assessed whether or not the company is actually in compliance with this standard. Then there's the internal or the external issues on which after the assessment, if the company doesn't comply with it, then it's acted upon. EU Circular Economy Action Plan. So EU's Circular Economy Action Plan is basically a strategic framework which was led by EU to shift from a linear take, make, dispose to a circular model. And it was updated in 2020 on the basis of a plan to just get rid of the linear usage where everything was being utilized and disposed of, creating lots of waste and therefore leading to plastic pollution. So, introducing new rules for high impact sectors like electronics, batteries, construction, and packaging, it basically redirected the continent to look for sustainable products and in order to comply with the norms. Sustainable development goals. So, when I talk about sustainable development goals, a lot of development goals come into mind. Obviously, first there is no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, and various others. However, when we focus on the SDG report of 2015, 2025, it basically did report that there still exists a discrepancy of at least um, 91% of the plastic that was generated in the world, it wasn't recycled. So at the same time, even though we are coming up with such goals that we need to achieve at least by 2030 or 2035, however, not much of it is being achieved at the grassroots level. So um, when I emphasize on the opinions put forward by scholars as well as some other writers who are basically experts in environment, they do believe that these conventions which are being formulated right now, even if they are coming from the UN organs, these are just like old wine in new bottle because these are just ideas and not really a lot has been implemented. Yeah. So this particular diagram basically talks about the circular action plan in terms of industries. So first off is the manufacturing, which could be of any industry like agriculture and forestry. And then it goes on to the consumption use, which is the auto industry or the constructions. Then it goes on to the recycling and reuse where we could assume that anything that has been consumed in the construction industry or the food and drinks could actually be reused as textiles or electrical and electronic equipment and batteries. So this is how in a CEAP plan, anything that is generated during manufacturing and consumed during the second stage can actually be recycled and reused. So, Circular Economy Act, as I said, certain plans of action in order to deal with environmental compliance have actually been transitioned into a soft law or a hard law. So, Circular Economy Act is not really a hard law. However, there are ways that certain countries have incorporated such a circular economic action plan into their framework of law. So, what is the basic aim of Circular Economy Act? It basically establishes a single market for secondary raw materials. It increases the supply of high quality recycled materials. It stimulates the demand for these materials within the EU. And at the same time, the ambition is basically laid out in the competitiveness compass to make the EU the world leader by 2030, which is basically their sort of prediction in the end, not really like a goal, but an aim. And the circularity rate is one way to measure how circular our economy is. This is basically a spectrum that they have come up with in order to measure how their circular model is built in order to get rid of the waste. And this number shows how much of the materials we use are recycled or reused instead of being thrown away. And lastly, the Circular Economy Act is actually built on the second Circular Economy Action Plan because when I talk about these plans, these are actually produced every 5 years. So every 5 years, these circular economy acts focus on certain strategies, whether it could be chemicals or zero waste generation or waste management plans, and so on. So every action plan has a number of strategies which is forming the basis of the act, and which is what the act itself came about in the second circular economy action plan. So key focus areas in the EUC EAP are: first is the sustainable products. And when I say sustainable products, it basically means that products which do not generate too much waste in the end when they are disposed. It basically focuses on an eco-friendly design so that the waste generated is little less. For instance, the eco design rules for electronics, textiles, vehicles, batteries, and constructions, they are basically generated in such a manner that the end stage of waste is not futile in a way that can't be reused. Second is the waste and resources, which is strategies for plastics, textiles, food, and promoting reuse or recycling of waste. Just basically sort of a repetition of the first point. And third is the sector specific strategies. As I mentioned earlier, these circular action plans, they focus on certain areas like textiles or chemicals or plastics. So in such manner, they are able to counter the problems that are focused in certain areas. And then the cross-cutting actions, which are basically focusing on the resources or digital tools to support for businesses and policies for secondary materials. So when we talk about evolution, the first plan which came about in 2015, it established the initial framework with 54 actions. And the new plan in 2020, updated under the European Green Deal, this version is more ambitious and focused more on the entire product life cycle and aim for a truly circular economy by 2050. So what this means is that the opportunities in repair, remanufacturing, and new circular business models, alongside new compliance requirements for product design and materials, a lot of changes came about. That means there it gave birth to this mode of re-engineering and remodeling. And so, for what this meant for the consumer was to have access to longer lasting and repairable products and better information. So, all these actions have been based upon certain core principles and goals. So, the first principle is the aim to eliminate waste and pollution, which is the principle to design products to be durable, repairable, and recyclable from the start, with new rules for packaging and persistent pollutants. The second is to circulate products and materials in order to create a strong market for secondary recycled raw materials and boost demand. So, therefore, they are able to reduce the reliance on virgin resources, which is basically those resources that can't be reused again. And then regenerate nature, which is basically to support biodiversity and use renewable energy. So, like I said earlier, biodiversity loss is one of the triple planetary crisis that we are dealing with. So, any strategy that is able to decrease the chances of having an extinction of species and disrupting the ecological harmony is something that would help us manage with the whole phenomena of biomagnification. And then the last core principle is to empower consumers, which is basically to provide clear information for sustainable choices and strengthen rights like the right to repair. So when I talk about the European Green Deal, their basic aim is to be like strive to be the first climate neutral continent. They want to transform EU into a modern, resource efficient, and competitive economy. And it was basically launched by the then President von der Leyen in 2019. And it responds to citizens' urgent call, especially from young people, for climate action. And this sets out a plan to transform Europe's economy, energy, transport, and industries for a more sustainable future. This aims to cut emissions by at least 50% by 2030, rising towards 55% while legally binding the 2050 neutrality goal through the European climate law. Therefore, this pushes forward a clean transition that protects people and planet. Now that I have talked about the conventions and strategies that are implemented by countries, this is basically just an analysis to show the margin of promises that are still kept, and still remains a discrepancy that the countries, governments, basically individuals or corporations, that they still need to do their part in order to be compliant with the environmental standards. So first off is the climate. When we talk about the climate neutrality and emissions reduction as a continuum to measure whether or not this entity has been able to comply with in this world, climate law, even though it has been entered into force, this particular law hasn't really made EU climate neutral and really some continent which is committed to be bound by it. Because even though there have been agreements to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and 90% reduction proposed for 2040, but these are just basically predictions and not really commitments. And second off is the financing, Next Generation EU and Repower EU. So basically, when we talk about funds, there always does exist a gap, since given the whole COVID-19 crisis that occurred in 2020 and that literally shook the economy. So due to recession and other geopolitical tension, this particular sector, the funding side of it, in terms of having sustainable development, the financial burden has been quite a lot on countries to meet the demands. So the basic finding that I found was that there has been 275 billion euros in clean investments and 42% of funds dedicated to climate action, which is a good amount. However, in terms of long run, we still have a lot to cover. In terms of just and fair transition, the Just Transition Fund allocated nearly 20 billion euros to invest in diversifying economies and rescaling workers in vulnerable regions. The Social Climate Fund helps vulnerable households with energy efficiency, clean heating, and transport. The EU's Solidarity Fund and EU's Civil Protection Mechanism supported countries in Europe and beyond when struck by climate related emergencies. Oh, this is again the key focus areas that we discussed earlier. It's just a breakdown of it. Yeah. So UN's approach for circular economy action plan. So when we talk about national level support, agencies help countries integrate circular economy principles into national development plans. There has also been cross-sectoral collaboration. So these collaboration basically facilitate partnerships between governments, businesses, academia, and NGOs to create systemic change, as seen with platforms like Circular Step from the UNECE region. So when I talk about STEP basically refers to a strategy that focuses on trade, innovation, marketing, and all in terms of the UNECE region, which also this particular region involves certain developing nations in focus. And policy and strategy development, the UN provides frameworks and tools to help nations develop roadmaps, promote sustainable public procurement, and establish regulatory environments. So, challenges and gaps. When now that I have actually gone through the sustainable development goals and the conventions which promises to meet them, however, there are still a lot of areas that need a little bit of attention. So first off is the sustainable development goals, even though they have been stated, but they are not really in track, especially when it comes to clean water and sanitation. There has been a significant regression and stagnation due to crises like COVID-19, climate shocks, and conflicts. And some positive steps, even though have been taken towards health, education, and energy access, because there have been projects coming up which focus on shifting from non-renewable resources to renewable resources in order to produce energy. However, not a lot has been achieved with such transitions, and access to basic water and sanitation saw modest gains. And global climate indicators, carbon dioxide levels, and biodiversity are actually worsening, therefore highlighting a severe peril to the 2030 agenda. Now, that when we talk about carbon pricing, it basically refers to a policy tool, and carbon pricing, it has originated from a Pigovian taxation. So, Pigovian taxation basically refers to getting taxed by the government for doing something that is negative. For instance, there were times when the government used to tax people for tobacco consumption, or for things that would impose hefty fines on industries for having non-biodegradable packaging, for instance. So all these methods, they fall under the carbon pricing, so that the carbon footprint is reduced. Therefore, this puts a cost on the greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide to encourage businesses and individuals to pollute less. Therefore, carbon pricing basically imposes a moral obligation and a financial burden on entities, so that they become more responsible in terms of being more compliant with the environment related standards. This works by creating a price signal, often through carbon tax and an emissions trading system, which is basically cap and trade. So, how does this work? It basically adds a hidden cost of emissions, for example, health impacts, extreme weather damage into price of fossil fuels and goods. Second is the price signal, which makes emitting carbon more expensive, prompting businesses to find ways to reduce emissions to save money. And third is, which is basically focusing on innovation. This encourages investment in cleaner technologies and energy sources. So what this basically does is, in 2020s, there was a time when companies like Levi's, they came up with recycling plastic bottles in order to make their signature jeans. So this basically drives companies to come up with mm, more creative way to evolve as a brand, as well as to re-engineer their products in order to comply with sustainable development, as well as encourage other corporations in order to implement their CSR, which basically so corporate social responsibilities. And the other common mechanisms are basically direct fee levied on each ton of carbon dioxide. So any amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted is actually measured, since the waste disposal is monitored. And when I talk about the cap and trade, a cap is basically set on the total emissions, and companies, they receive or buy allowances to emit, and they emit less because they sell their surplus allowances. So, way forward, when we talk about the possibilities in order to how then we could be able to implement such conventions, as well as enforce such methods, one needs to consider the fact that there needs to be a robust governance and leadership, because having a plan is not really enough, but in order to execute such planning, it is essential that the government actually comes up with the whole groundwork, so that the individuals as well as the corporations, they are held responsible at the grassroots level, and not just impose strict liability when it comes to the damage that is caused due to pollution or any other resource depletion that occurs due to their processes. Second is the implementation of strategic systems and technology. And this is basically to do with the technological advancement that can help the companies to comply with the standards better, so that they are not really too damaging with their processes. in terms of being environment friendly with their products and services. Third is the enhancing of transparency and reporting. So in these recent years, there has been instances when the ships have actually caused pollution, such as the MV Vacasio oil spills. So it has been pretty prominent with their procedures in this world that countries have come up with their own laws so that the ship owners are held responsible through laws enacted, so that they are held responsible for any sort of pollution that is caused due to their malfunctioning, as in like their setbacks if they have not been able to prove that their ships are seaworthy. So that is one example of ensuring that there is transparency or there is ethical standards being followed in terms of reporting. And this in turn actually gives rise to a culture of compliance. And this can actually be implemented by adopting proactive regulatory measures, which, like I said, certain legal frameworks need to be developed in order to enforce these multinational conventions to be implemented in a domestic legal framework, which is the only way how the countries can be able to implement it at the grassroots level, which is in terms of industries being able to dispose their waste without compromising with the neighborhood. This is just an example to say how law helps in the national level better in order to keep the countries responsible. So this is just basically a comic that helps you understand how carbon tax is implemented. So this is basically how a government can actually come up with plans to implement direct regulations as to, oh, new cars must average 40 miles a gallon, or new efficiency standards must be complied with in terms of appliances when they're utilized and stuff like that. So this is just an example of how market-based approaches they come up, and carbon taxes are implemented in terms of trade systems.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Shweta, for that truly insightful and engaging session. Your perspective on environmental accountability has added tremendous value to today's discussion. The way you connected global frameworks with real world enforcement challenges has certainly given all of us a lot to reflect upon. We will now take a few minutes to have a look at Uni Athena and some of our academic offerings and global learning opportunities. Meanwhile, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. We will be collecting them and addressing them shortly with Ms. Shweta. Okay, so dear participants, as you know, we are Uni Athena. We are known for offering flexible, affordable, and accessible online learning programs. This we are basically offering a suite of online, self-paced, and flexible education programs. We have been joined with over 5 million global upskillers. Uni Athena is an edtech organization offering free learning upskilling courses and affordable academic programs. Founded in 2019, Uni Athena is owned by Westford Ventures, generally known as the Westford Education Group, where we have been connected with 5 million plus learners, offering 700 plus courses in about 146 plus countries with 10 plus partners. Our partner and accreditations come from Alberta University, UCAM, Unimarconi, CIQ, CMI, SQA, Acacia University, European Business School, OTHM qualifications, and Federation of European Education. Why should you choose Uni Athena? For 100% online learning experience, for a payment that fits your pace, where you pay per the course module with a flexible plan, self-paced learning with flexible course duration, while you learn at your own pace, accredited university partner, globally accepted and accredited partners, personal tutor or academic associate to assist your online delivery, and modular course delivery, where you learn modules. Courses are delivered with different set of modules. If you are looking for a career in occupational safety and compliance, you will love our offerings. So, this is the journey ahead, the top recommendations that we want you to check out on our website: MBA in Construction and Safety Management, MBA in Industrial Safety Management, Postgraduate Certificate in Environment, Health and Safety Management, Postgraduate Certificate in Construction Safety, and Diploma in Occupational Safety. So here are some learner feedbacks where you can just see David had taken with us a postgraduate certificate in environmental health and safety. He says, my personal tutor assisted me in thoroughly explaining health and safety management procedures in a simple and easy to follow manner. Fanuel was our master in construction management learner. He says this master degree is an ideal complement to my experience. The program modules are thorough and thought provoking yet easy to understand. So now we are open for questions. If you have any queries related to our courses, please feel free to mail on the email IDs that are given on the screen, or feel free to WhatsApp us. Over to you, Shweta. You can choose the questions that you want to answer from the Q&A box.
All right. Thank you, Ankita. I'm just going through the chat. So, mm, hi, Dr. Shahira. I'm looking at this question that you have asked me regarding digital product passport under the action plan. How do I see these being standardized globally so that national policies in other regions don't become fragmented or incompatible? So I'm guessing that you are asking me whether digital product passport encourages regional sustainable development, because if these become a standard globally, so how are national policies going to help in sustainable development? So I'll just answer in that context. So I think that this is basically a first step towards sustainable development, as in order to reduce the e-waste or any sort of waste generation. So I don't think that there would actually be a fragmented sustainable development, since such national policies, I mean, it's kind of common knowledge that it's only the first world countries or the developed nations that are coming up with the digital product passports. But I think that in the long run it won't be fragmented, because as the time is passing by, many other countries are also coming up with their own digital products. So I don't think this would lead to a fragmented or an incompatible development. And moving on to other questions. I'm unable to find one question that I saw which was really interesting. I think someone had asked that since yes. Hi, Abhinyash. I see that you're asking me that EU is doing a lot in climate change and carbon sequestration. So I don't know what sequestration means. I think that's just very in a way. So what is India is doing in this sector? So just to answer that, India has basically come up with its own Niti Aayog, and Niti Aayog has at least 10 sectors focusing on climate change and carbon footprint. So the climate change, which is being dealt by EU through circular economy action plan, is basically just another incorporation in the form of Niti Aayog by India. So since EU has CEAP, India has Niti Aayog. So that way we do have a premier think tank that implements various strategies in order to enforce any sort of sustainable development. So basically India does look into a lot of judicious usage of resources. Mm, I'm seeing a lot of compliments being made. Thank you. And any
So
other
Shweta, there is
questions?
yeah, there is one question which even I find interesting. I think that will be our last question. So
Okay.
Solvin says, kindly could you give more details about accountability in relation with sanitation sector?
Ah, yes. See, when we talk about accountability in sanitation sector, so first off, there is the United Nations organs that is the UN programs which focus on the sanitation sector, and the SDG report of 2025 has actually published a report. So to answer this question, I would have to like share that report with you because it's a lot of statistics. So this analysis I basically made looking into how far along the sanitation sector has actually met with the prediction of UN expectations. So right now it is still lagging, but in terms of the accountability on the part of country, it is still poor, and so there is a lot of legwork to be done by the countries. And Ankita, is it possible for me to like share the SDG report with this participant if it's possible? Because it's like basically statistics and not really like an answer because like as I said, there is just a discrepancy. So it's not a lot being met by the countries in terms of global accountability since the year of 2025 and when this particular SDG was actually implemented in the early 2000s. So yeah.
I guess we can add it to any downloadable material if we are having an option on YouTube. But the presentation that we have shared with our participants will be
Mm.
available on our YouTube recording. Uh, and so far as there are other questions coming in related to the certificate, I'm sure you have registered with the email. So basically, there will be a link coming in your email inbox post the presentation. So there is where you can get your certificate. And thank you everyone for joining in today, making this session a very engaging one. And I'm sure we all will now be taking Google, accountability or environmental accountability seriously. We'll also, keep reading, keep ourselves aware about it. And thank you everyone for joining in today. And have a very, very happy weekend. And do take care of yourselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.